And we're back with former Treasury Secretary Bob Rubin. Let's start with that last bit. People talk about a crisis and how it's going to test the next president. Well, you've been watching, in a sense, a crisis that is testing Barack Obama already, the financial crisis. You've been in on a number of meetings where he has formulated and decided what his position is going to be, what he would do if he were president, all that kind of thing. Describe what Obama is like in those meetings.
I think he's remarkable, Fareed. I first met him about 4 years ago through a fellow who had worked with me at Treasury, my chief of staff at Treasury, who had been on the Harvard Law Review with him. And then after Hillary dropped out, I got very involved with Barack, and there are a small group of us, Larry Summers, Laura Tyson, Paul Volcker, in some measure Warren Buffett, and a few others a little bit more intermittently, who've been very involved with him. And I would say that we probably talk with him once a week, perhaps, either on the phone most of the time or occasionally in person. And each time he does the same thing. He says, I want to put all politics aside, I want to put the campaign aside, and I want to really focus on what's happening. And it is a remarkable thing for somebody to do in the middle of a campaign. He has tremendous seriousness of purpose. He is very bright, as we all know. He thinks, he makes decisions very much like President Clinton did. He wants to get all the factors on the table, and then he weighs and balances them and tries to judge what the probabilities and the trade-offs are. And he's very much the leader of these discussions. He is the leader of his own economic team. I think he's really and truly terrific.
How would he, but he seems very different temperamentally from Clinton.
He's different temperamentally, but he's very similar in the way that he approaches decisions. He recognizes the inherent complexity of issues, and he's very much focused on trying to get in front of him all the considerations, including the views of those who disagree with him. And then he's very much a weigher and a balancer. You know, temperamentally, it's interesting. They are somewhat different, but they both have a sense of humor. Obama has a very good sort of ironic sense of humor. And they're both very similar to work for in the sense that they're engaged, they're interacting. And I don't think that Senator Obama cares whether you're a 35-year-old who's sitting at the table or you're double that age and much more experienced. What he cares about is the substance that you bring to the discussion. And that's exactly the way President Clinton was. Okay,
so let's assume Obama gets elected and he calls you a couple of days later and says, Bob, the country is facing an enormous economic crisis. I'd like you to come back as Secretary of the Treasury.
Well, first place, when you say assume he gets elected, I'd say if he gets elected. I think he has all the attributes to be a terrific president, but I still think there's going to be a very tough election. Senator Obama knows that it is not my view of my own life to go in that direction. I also think there are some really, really outstanding people that he could appoint to that job, and I think he will be very, very well served, whatever choice he makes amongst those people. But I'm not going back to Washington.
In some ways, I mean, it's a massive version of the problem you guys faced in 1992. There were a number of people saying the budget is not as important. We need to have very large spending programs of various kinds. You were among the people telling President Clinton, no, the budget is very important because you're sending a signal to the markets that America is in good shape fiscally and on the right track fiscally. So now you have this problem on steroids because the needs are even more great. We've let our infrastructure wear down. We have needs, we need to make energy investments. On the other hand, the budget deficit makes the Clinton budget, the budget deficit you inherited look like nothing. So what would you do? Would you worry more about deficit reduction or would you worry more about stimulus?
I would do both, and let me tell you what I would do. The other difference, Fareed, was that in 1992 and then 93 when President Clinton became president, we had high interest rates. Right. And our view at the time was bring deficits down, interest rates hopefully will come down and you'll have stimulation of the economy and so forth. Then it worked, and it was, I think, a very good decision on President Clinton's part. Senator Obama, if he gets elected, or whoever gets elected, is going to face a different situation because interest rates are already low. I think we should do the following. I think we need a very large fiscal stimulus now. I think there'll be a debate about how large that should be, but I think it should be very large, and it should be constructed so that it gives you a lot of economic demand relative to the dollars that you spend and takes effect right now. Secondly—
Which means tax cuts or infrastructure?
Well, my own personal predilection would be to think that it should be more infrastructure if we can find infrastructure projects that are immediately effective. That may be ones that are being slowed down because of lack of resources or whatever. There's been a lot of bad experience in saying that infrastructure can be done immediately and then it doesn't get done immediately. But I think there's enough that could be done, so yes, infrastructure. But I also think unemployment insurance, food stamps, there's a program called LIHEAP, which is for poor people who need assistance in that respect. A lot of states and cities are facing
block
deficits.
grants.
They're going to force them to cut back. You could provide assistance to states and cities, and that would create a lot of activity. And perhaps rebates. Well, I actually think tax rebates are probably, even if they're properly focused on the lower and middle income people, as they should be, even then are probably less effective than the spending. But my guess is...
Because people are seeming to save that money rather than spend
because
it.
they'll save some portion of it. And in the long run, we need to have a higher savings rate, a personal savings rate. But in the short run, that is counterproductive.
Right.
Secondly, I think that he's got to marry a large fiscal stimulus with a real commitment to reestablishing sound fiscal conditions in this country over time, because failure to do that can create the kinds of problems that you were just alluding to, which is that you create great concerns in the international markets, that undermines our bond market, undermines our currency, and that would be hugely counterproductive. So I think you have to marry those two. Strong stimulus now, connected with a commitment to reestablishing sound fiscal conditions over time, and in that context, you have to leave budgetary room for critical public investment in the many areas that you mentioned: infrastructure, education, healthcare, and the rest. It's not simple. I think it's doable. It will involve sequencing, but it's going to take enormous seriousness of purpose. And I don't think any question Senator Obama has exactly that seriousness of purpose and thoughtfulness, and I might add, pragmatic problem-solving approach, which is going to take.
On that note, Robert Rubin, thank you so much.
Thank you, Fareed. It was very good to be with you.
Pleasure.